There is one sentence structure that bypasses all conscious resistance and speaks directly to the unconscious mind in a way that makes people naturally want to comply with your requests. Not because you're manipulating them, not because you're threatening them, but because you're communicating in a language that their deepest psychological structures recognize as authentic authority. Carl Jung discovered this through decades of therapeutic work, where he had to guide people towards psychological breakthroughs they were consciously resisting. He found that certain ways of framing requests or observations create what he called unconscious cooperation, a state where people's deeper wisdom recognizes the truth or necessity of what you're saying, even when their surface mind wants to resist. But here's what makes this approach so devastatingly effective in everyday interactions. You're not trying to overpower people's conscious will or manipulate their emotions. You're speaking to what Jung called the self, the deeper, wiser part of their psyche that actually wants to make good decisions and respond appropriately to genuine authority. Today, I'm going to share with you the exact sentence structure that Jung used to create breakthrough moments with the most resistant patients, and how you can adapt this psychological insight to generate natural compliance in professional situations, personal relationships, and social interactions. What I'm about to teach you isn't manipulation or coercion. This is about learning to communicate with such psychological authenticity that people's unconscious mind recognizes you as someone worth listening to and naturally wants to cooperate with your reasonable requests. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But what he discovered was that certain ways of communicating create transformative reactions, where people naturally align with your leadership because you're speaking to their highest psychological functioning rather than their ego defenses. If you want to learn how to communicate with the kind of psychological authority that generates natural respect and willing cooperation without manipulation or force, make sure to subscribe to this channel. We explore the deep insights about human psychology that can transform how you influence and interact with others. The sentence structure I'm about to share with you works because it bypasses the ego's need to resist authority and speaks directly to what Jung called the wise old person archetype within everyone's unconscious, the part of them that actually wants to make good decisions and respond appropriately to legitimate guidance. This isn't about controlling people. This is about learning to communicate in a way that makes people feel psychologically safe to comply with reasonable requests because they recognize you're operating from genuine authority rather than insecure dominance. First principle. Jung discovered that the most psychologically powerful communications begin with what he called acknowledgement of the person's autonomy before requesting compliance. Most people try to generate obedience by making demands, applying pressure, or using authority as force. But Jung found that the unconscious mind responds most cooperatively when it feels its freedom is being respected, even as guidance is being offered. The sentence structure that creates this psychological dynamic is, "You have every right to refuse, choose differently, make your own decision. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to specific request because genuine reason that serves them or the situation." This structure is devastatingly effective because it accomplishes several things simultaneously. First, it acknowledges their autonomy, which immediately reduces unconscious resistance. Second, it frames your request as optional rather than demanded, which paradoxically makes people more likely to comply because they don't feel their freedom is being threatened. Third, it provides a reason that appeals to their higher judgment rather than trying to override their judgment. Here's how this might sound in practice. You have every right to handle this situation however you think best, and I'm wondering if you'd be willing to consider waiting until tomorrow to make this decision, because I think you might have access to important information that could change your perspective. What makes this approach so powerful is that you're speaking to what Jung called the adult ego state, rather than triggering defensive or rebellious responses. You're treating the person as capable of making good decisions while offering guidance that serves their interests rather than just your own. Jung observed that people have an unconscious ability to distinguish between requests that come from genuine authority and attempts to manipulate or control them. When you acknowledge their autonomy before making a request, you're demonstrating that your authority comes from wisdom and concern, rather than need for dominance. The psychological effect is that people feel safer complying with your request because they know they could refuse if they wanted to. This safety actually increases their willingness to cooperate because compliance feels like choice rather than submission. Second principle, use what Jung called appeal to their highest psychological functioning by framing your requests in terms of the person they want to be, rather than trying to override their current resistance. Most people try to generate compliance by focusing on what they want the person to do. But Jung discovered that the unconscious responds more powerfully when requests are framed in terms of the person's own values, identity, or aspirations. The sentence structure for this approach is, I know you're someone who, positive trait they value about themselves. And that's exactly why I believe you'd want to requested action in this situation. This works because you're connecting your request to their self-concept in a way that makes compliance feel like an expression of their best qualities rather than surrender to external pressure. You're appealing to what Jung called the idealized self, the person they aspire to be, and showing how your request allows them to embody that identity. Here's how this might sound. I know you're someone who cares deeply about fairness, and that's exactly why I believe you'd want to hear both sides of this situation before making your final decision. Or, I know you're someone who takes pride in doing excellent work, and that's exactly why I believe you'd want to double-check these numbers before we submit the report. What makes this approach psychologically irresistible is that you're not asking them to do something that conflicts with their identity. You're showing them how your request allows them to express their identity more fully. Compliance becomes a way of being true to themselves rather than accommodating someone else's demands. Jung understood that most resistance comes from people feeling that compliance would require them to violate their self-concept or surrender their autonomy. But when you frame requests as opportunities for them to express their best qualities, resistance dissolves because cooperation serves their psychological needs rather than threatening them. Third principle, Jung recognized that the most powerful communications include what he called implicit future benefit for their psychological development. People's unconscious mind is always oriented toward growth, learning, and becoming more fully themselves. When you can connect your request to their developmental journey, compliance becomes psychologically attractive rather than just practically necessary. The sentence structure for this approach is, I'm asking you to specific request not just because immediate practical reason, but because I think the experience of doing this action will help you develop some quality or capability that serves their growth. This approach works because you're positioning your request as an opportunity for personal development rather than just a task to be completed. You're appealing to what Jung called the individuation drive, the unconscious impulse towards psychological wholeness and authentic self-expression. Here's how this might sound. I'm asking you to take the lead on this presentation, not just because you have the expertise, but because I think the experience of presenting to senior leadership will help you develop the executive presence I know you want to cultivate. Or, I'm asking you to have this difficult conversation with your colleague, not just to resolve the immediate conflict, but because I think learning to address interpersonal tensions directly will serve you well throughout your career. What makes this approach so effective is that you're connecting immediate compliance with long-term psychological benefit. People's unconscious mind recognizes that you're offering them something valuable rather than just taking something from them. Jung observed that people are naturally drawn to opportunities for growth and development, even when those opportunities require effort or discomfort. When you can frame your requests as developmental experiences, people become willing participants rather than reluctant compliers. Fourth principle: apply what Jung called acknowledgement of their internal conflict before resolution. Most people experience internal resistance when asked to do things they don't immediately want to do. Instead of ignoring this resistance or trying to override it, Jung found that acknowledging it directly and then providing a path through it creates powerful psychological cooperation. The sentence structure for this is, I imagine part of you acknowledges their likely resistance, and I also imagine part of you acknowledges what they would gain from compliance. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to specific request so we can honor both parts of what you're feeling. This approach is devastatingly effective because you're demonstrating that you understand their psychological complexity rather than trying to pretend their resistance doesn't exist or shouldn't matter. You're speaking to their internal conflict with compassion while providing a way to resolve it constructively. Here's how this might sound. I imagine part of you really doesn't want to deal with this conversation right now. And I also imagine part of you knows it needs to happen for everyone involved. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to schedule 30 minutes tomorrow morning so we can address this while respecting your need for adequate preparation time. Or, I imagine part of you feels frustrated about having to redo this work. And I also imagine part of you takes pride in delivering excellent results. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to make these revisions so the final product reflects the quality standards I know matter to you. What makes this approach psychologically powerful is that you're validating their resistance while providing a path toward resolution that honors their complexity. You're not trying to talk them out of their feelings or convince them their resistance is wrong. You're showing them how to move forward in a way that acknowledges all aspects of their experience. Jung understood that internal conflict is a normal part of psychological functioning, and people respond much more cooperatively when their conflict is acknowledged rather than ignored or dismissed. Fifth principle: use what Jung called invitation into shared responsibility for outcomes by framing your requests as opportunities for collaboration rather than unilateral demands. Most people resist compliance when it feels like submission to someone else's agenda. But Jung found that the unconscious responds powerfully when requests are framed as invitations to participate in creating outcomes that serve everyone involved. The sentence structure for this approach is, I need your specific skill, perspective, contribution to help us achieve shared outcome. And I'm hoping you'd be willing to specific request so we can mutual benefit together. This works because you're positioning the person as a valued collaborator rather than a subordinate who needs to follow instructions. You're appealing to their desire to contribute meaningfully rather than just comply obediently. Here's how this might sound. I need your analytical skills to help us make the best decision about this budget allocation, and I'm hoping you'd be willing to review these financial projections so we can present a thoroughly researched recommendation to the board. Or, I need your honest feedback to help me improve this presentation, and I'm hoping you'd be willing to attend the practice session so we can make sure the final version serves our audience effectively. What makes this approach psychologically compelling is that you're inviting people to use their strengths in service of shared goals, rather than asking them to submit to your authority. Compliance becomes an expression of their value and capability, rather than acknowledgement of your power over them. Jung observed that people have a deep need to feel useful and valued. When your requests provide opportunities for them to contribute their gifts toward meaningful outcomes, cooperation becomes psychologically satisfying rather than just practically necessary. And here we reach Jung's most profound insight about generating genuine compliance from others. The goal isn't to make people obey you. The goal is to communicate in ways that make cooperation feel like the natural, intelligent, beneficial response to reasonable requests from someone who clearly has their best interests in mind. Jung understood that authentic authority doesn't come from position, force, or manipulation. It comes from psychological integration, genuine concern for others' welfare, and the ability to communicate in ways that appeal to people's highest functioning rather than their fears or insecurities. When you combine acknowledgement of autonomy, appeal to identity, connection to development, recognition of internal conflict, and invitation to collaboration, you create a communication approach that makes people want to cooperate with you because cooperation serves their psychological needs as well as practical goals. The one sentence that makes people obey you isn't actually about obedience at all. It's about communicating with such psychological sophistication that people recognize you as someone worth listening to, someone who understands them deeply, and someone whose guidance serves their highest interests. Jung's ultimate insight was that people naturally cooperate with authority. They perceive as legitimate, wise, and genuinely concerned with their welfare. When you learn to communicate from this place of integrated authority, compliance becomes a natural response rather than a reluctant submission. The next time you need someone to cooperate with a request, remember Jung's approach. Don't try to overpower their resistance or manipulate their emotions. Instead, communicate in a way that acknowledges their autonomy, appeals to their best qualities, connects to their growth, recognizes their complexity, and invites them into meaningful collaboration. This approach doesn't just generate compliance, it builds respect, trust, and willing partnership that makes future cooperation increasingly natural and easy. You become someone people want to work with rather than someone they feel forced to obey. This is what Jung called psychological leadership, the ability to guide others not through domination, but through such clear understanding of human nature that your guidance feels like wisdom they want to follow, rather than authority they must submit to.